At 2:41 a.m. on November 13th, the sky over Kyiv erupted into a wall of fire. Air raid sirens howled across a city of nearly 3 million as radar screens lit up with 430 incoming Shahed drones and 18 cruise missiles launched from Russian bombers positioned over the Caspian Sea. Within minutes, 27 residential buildings were struck. 2 hospitals were torn open, windows shattered across entire neighborhoods. Families grabbed children, blankets, documents, anything within reach as explosions rolled through the capital like a drumline of terror designed to break morale before winter. But something unexpected happened. While smoke was still rising over Kyiv, while first responders were still evacuating 90 hospital patients in the dark, Ukraine activated a second operation, one that had been quietly prepared for weeks. At 4:12 a.m., a wave of Ukrainian long-range drones and domestically produced Neptune missiles shot across the Black Sea at low altitude. Their target? Russia's most important oil lifeline, the Novorossiysk port, a facility responsible for 30 to 35% of all Russian oil exports, worth billions every month. And then the unthinkable happened. The first explosions hit a cluster of Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense batteries guarding the port. The second wave struck the oil terminal. The third wave ignited a fuel depot, creating a fireball so large that Russian civilians 40 kilometers away filmed the sky turning orange. By sunrise, Russia's main Black Sea export route was offline. Oil markets jumped 3% in a single morning. The contrast shocked the world. Russia had gone after hospitals and apartments. Ukraine had gone after the financial engine of Putin's war. And this was only the beginning, because what happened next, and what global intelligence agencies detected in the following hours, sent a new message across Europe, NATO, and the Kremlin. The war had just crossed a new threshold. To understand why the Novorossiysk strike shook the Kremlin, the region, and global markets, it helps to step back and look at the deeper story. This is not simply Ukraine hitting back after a night of terror. This is a collision between 2 doctrines, 2 economies, and 2 visions for Europe's future. And the battlefield now stretches far beyond trenches in Donetsk or drone duels over the Black Sea. For Russia, Novorossiysk is not just a port. It is the anchor of an entire strategy built over 2 decades. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022, Moscow funneled enormous resources into expanding its Black Sea export routes. According to multiple international financial analyses, the port handles roughly 2 million barrels of oil per day, shipped through pipelines connecting Siberian fields, Kazakh exports, and refineries across southern Russia. In simple terms, Novorossiysk is one of the few remaining arteries feeding the Russian state budget. When it stops, revenue falls. When revenue falls, the Kremlin's ability to sustain a grinding, high-cost war weakens. Ukraine understands this better than anyone. Since 2023, Kyiv's military intelligence agencies have shifted from defending territory to strategically degrading Russia's military-industrial complex. They learned that precision strikes on refineries, depots, and ports deliver far more impact than trading blows on fixed front lines. The strategy aligns with Western assessments published by major outlets throughout 2024 and 2025. Russia's weakness is no longer tanks. It is logistics, energy, and production cycles stretched to the breaking point. This is where the contrast becomes staggering. Russia still relies on Soviet-era doctrine built around fear, mass strikes, civilian intimidation, winter pressure. It is a strategy designed to inflict exhaustion, especially in urban hubs like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. The November 13th attack, hitting hospitals and high-rise buildings, reflects this mindset. It is not about gaining territory. It is about breaking society. Ukraine, meanwhile, uses a modern adaptive model shaped by limited resources but sharp intelligence. A single domestically built missile costing under $500,000 can disable infrastructure worth billions. Drone fleets costing a fraction of a fighter jet can overwhelm the most advanced Russian air defenses. This asymmetry, small versus massive, cheap versus expensive, defines the conflict in 2025. It is also political. With Donald Trump back in the White House, Washington's internal debates over military aid, deterrence, and escalation have intensified. The November 13th events added new layers to these discussions. A Russian strike on hospitals poses uncomfortable questions for Western policymakers. A Ukrainian strike on a critical oil terminal, however, reframes the conflict. The war is no longer contained inside Ukrainian territory, and that is why this moment matters. Because Novorossiysk is more than a port. It is a symbol of the Kremlin's remaining economic strength, and suddenly, it is vulnerable. The door to a new phase of the war has quietly opened. The sequence that unfolded between 2:41 a.m. and sunrise on November 13th now looks, in hindsight, like a perfectly timed chain reaction, one that neither Moscow nor global energy markets fully anticipated. What began as a night of chaos in Kyiv quickly turned into a cascading escalation that exposed cracks in Russia's air defense network, its oil logistics, and even its domestic information control. The first layer of the night was the strike on Kyiv. Russian forces launched 430 Shahed drones from occupied Crimea and Kursk, followed by 18 Kh-101 and Caliber missiles fired from bombers and naval platforms. Analysts from several Western defense outlets later noted that this was one of Russia's largest single-wave drone barrages in months. The intent was unmistakable: overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses and force civilians underground in freezing temperatures. Apartment blocks shook as impacts rolled through the capital. Emergency crews evacuated entire hospital wings under flashlight beams. Videos posted by Kyiv residents captured a river of glass cascading down high-rise facades. But even as Ukrainian firefighters battled flames on the ground, a second, entirely separate operation had already begun. At 3:17 a.m., Ukrainian military intelligence activated a pre-positioned swarm of long-range drones over the Black Sea. These drones, flying just 30 to 50 meters above the water, carried out the first phase, mapping and jamming Russian radar around Novorossiysk. The port's defenses, 2 S-300 batteries, 1 S-400 launcher, and a Pantsir S-1 unit began lighting up their tracking radars in response. That was exactly the window Ukraine needed. At 4:12 a.m., the first Neptune missile entered Russian airspace. Traveling at subsonic speed but with tight sea-skimming patterns, it slipped beneath Russian radar and struck the S-400 complex. The blast was so intense that residents filmed a shockwave rippling across the hills above the port. Moments later, a second strike hit a nearby ammunition storage site. The resulting mushroom cloud rose hundreds of meters, a scene that spread across Russian social media even before authorities attempted to suppress it. Then came the twist Russia did not expect. After disabling air defenses, Ukraine launched a third wave. Drones loaded with fuel-air explosives aimed at the oil terminal's pumping stations and storage tanks. One tank ruptured instantly, sending a column of flame into the night sky. A second tank ignited minutes later. Shadows of fleeing workers, emergency vehicles, and sparks raining down over the water filled Russian telegram channels. But an even bigger shock came from the sea. A shadow tanker, part of Russia's covert fleet used to bypass international sanctions, suffered blast damage from falling debris. Satellite images taken hours later and reviewed by Western analysts showed scorch marks along its deck. This was an unexpected and deeply symbolic blow. Moscow's shadow fleet has been the backbone of its sanctions-evading oil trade, and now one of its vessels was visibly crippled inside Russia's own port. As flames raged at Novorossiysk, Ukraine activated a fourth and final phase. Drones struck secondary structures, a cargo terminal, a maintenance depot, and several cranes. These were not random targets. Analysts believe they were chosen to disrupt Russia's ability to resume exports quickly. If the air defenses were the shield and the oil tanks were the heart, the cranes and depots were the arteries tying the system together. When dawn broke over the Black Sea, smoke still billowed from the waterfront. Russian emergency crews struggled against fires that had burned for hours. Navigation maps briefly marked the port restricted, and several tankers were forced to anchor offshore. By mid-morning, Russia's Ministry of Energy issued a rare statement acknowledging that exports were suspended. Behind the scenes, according to Western reporting, Russian officials scrambled to assess the full scale of the damage. Local authorities attempted to reassure residents, but Russian commentators, even some on state television, called the strike a severe blow. Then came the second unexpected twist. Oil markets responded instantly. Prices rose nearly 3% within hours. Traders and analysts saw what many governments had feared. A targeted strike on a single Russian port could shift global energy flows. The economic shockwave traveled faster than the missiles themselves. And the third twist was political. By midday, the Biden-Trump transition team received briefings indicating that Ukraine's attack had exposed vulnerabilities in Russia's Black Sea logistics, far more severe than earlier Western estimates. Some lawmakers quietly asked whether similar Ukrainian attacks, if repeated, could force Russia to divert major resources away from the front. The night that began with terror in Kyiv had escalated into one of the most strategically consequential exchanges of 2025. And for the first time in months, Kremlin insiders privately admitted to international reporters that the war has reached a new stage. But the consequences were only beginning. By midday on November 13th, as smoke still drifted across the Black Sea, the scale of the strike on Novorossiysk began to crystallize. What at first appeared to be a single port temporarily offline quickly revealed itself to be a multi-dimensional shock to Russia's economy, military operations, and internal political stability. Western analysts describe the event as a structural hit, not a symbolic one. In a conflict defined by drones, trench lines, and exhausted logistics, a structural hit reverberates through every layer of the system. The first and most immediate impact was economic. Russia's budget remains heavily dependent on oil, a fact repeatedly highlighted by major economic outlets throughout 2024 and 2025. According to their calculations, more than 35% of federal revenue comes directly from oil and gas exports. Novorossiysk alone handles 30 to 35% of Russian crude exports, including shipments from the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which links Kazakhstan's Tengiz fields to the Black Sea coast. When operations halt, revenue halts. Even a 48-hour interruption can remove hundreds of millions of dollars from Russia's daily liquidity flow. Within hours of the strike, global markets reacted decisively. Data tracked by international financial platforms showed crude benchmarks jumping nearly 3%, marking one of the sharpest single-morning increases since the spring of 2024. Analysts connected the spike to a sudden reassessment of risk. If Ukraine can suppress one port, it can suppress others. If one Ukrainian missile can force Russian exports offline, a pattern of repeated strikes could reshape the global oil landscape for months. For the Kremlin, this creates a dangerous pressure point. Russia's economy, already strained by sanctions and war-related expenses, now faces vulnerabilities that go far beyond battlefield losses. Production declines in the Urals region, tightening supplies of spare parts for refineries, and an aging tanker fleet have left Russia dependent on a few major export terminals. Losing even one for an extended period threatens GDP projections for 2025. Reports from multiple international agencies warn that Russia's economic growth, estimated at around 1.2% for next year, could contract rapidly if Ukraine continues this strategy. The second impact lies in the military realm. Novorossiysk is not just an oil port. It is also a logistical node for Russia's Black Sea fleet, housing repair facilities, fuel depots, and ammunition storage sites. Western defense analysts noted that the destruction of S-300 and S-400 batteries at the port forces Russia to pull air defense assets from elsewhere, likely from occupied Crimea or the Belgorod region. Redeployment at this scale takes weeks, not days. During this window, Ukraine gains freedom of action across the coastline, enabling deeper strikes on military infrastructure and supply hubs. Satellite imagery reviewed by multiple defense outlets also confirmed damage to cranes, loading arms, and maintenance structures, meaning Russia cannot simply extinguish fires and resume exports. Some of the repairs require specialized equipment imported before sanctions tightened, Replacement cycles can run from 4 to 12 weeks. This delay limits Russia's ability to move refined products, bunker fuel, and crude, placing further strain on its wartime logistics. Societal impact formed the third layer of consequences. Russian civilians across Krasnodar Krai filmed the explosions as they lit up the horizon. The scale of the blast, the orange glow reflecting off apartment windows, and the frantic voices in videos shared on social platforms revealed something new: shock. For many Russians, this was the closest the war had ever come to their homes. Major state broadcasters attempted to downplay the event, referring to drone debris rather than Ukrainian missiles, but independent monitoring groups recorded unusual spikes in online searches from southern Russia for terms like oil terminal attack, Novorossiysk fire, and S-400 destroyed, suggesting that the information blockade had slipped. That breach is politically significant. Russia's leadership has long depended on the narrative that the war is distant, contained, and tightly controlled. When a port city witnesses a mushroom cloud rising above its coastline, the illusion fractures. Commentators on several Russian-language channels, normally aligned with the Kremlin, briefly questioned how such a critical port could be left vulnerable. For a leadership obsessed with projecting control, even mild internal criticism signals danger. Fourth, the strategic messaging of the strike delivered a powerful psychological blow. The contrast between Russia's attacks on hospitals and Ukraine's precision strike on a financial artery sharpened global perceptions. Reports from Western outlets emphasized the difference. One side hit civilians, the other hit a revenue engine. This distinction matters in diplomacy. It shapes how allies, financial institutions, and neutral states interpret the trajectory of the conflict. Ukraine's message, "This is the cost of targeting civilians," echoed far beyond the port itself. Even China, one of Russia's major economic partners, reportedly expressed private concern about the vulnerability of Black Sea trade routes. Several analysts noted that Beijing relies heavily on stable oil flows and may quietly pressure Moscow to reinforce port security or adjust its military posture. Finally, the strike disrupted Russia's broader war strategy. Winter campaigns historically hinge on energy leverage, both domestically and internationally. Moscow counts on steady oil exports to fund operations and maintain public stability during freezing months. When infrastructure burns and ports close, that leverage weakens. Ukrainian officials hinted at further strikes, signaling a shift toward persistent pressure rather than isolated hits. In sum, the Novorossiysk attack reshaped the battlefield without moving a single trench line. It damaged Russia's revenue, exposed military vulnerabilities, rattled civilians, and weakened the Kremlin's political narrative, all in one night. And for the first time since the start of the war, the balance of strategic initiative edged noticeably toward Kyiv. The question now is how far this economic warfare will go, and whether Russia can adapt before the next blow arrives. The strike on Novorossiysk did not stay a regional story for long. Within hours, it became a global event, one that reshaped diplomatic calculations in Washington, Berlin, Brussels, Beijing, and across the Middle East. Because whether governments admit it publicly or not, the war in Ukraine has always been larger than a fight over territory. It is a contest over energy flows, power projection, alliance cohesion, and the future of deterrence in an era defined by cheap weapons and fragile supply chains. The first major response came from NATO officials. Early briefings described the Ukrainian strike as a demonstration of precision and strategic clarity, according to several international defense outlets. The destruction of Russian S-300 and S-400 batteries at Novorossiysk triggered immediate military discussions inside the alliance. Not about escalation, but about opportunity. If a handful of domestically produced missiles could neutralize one of Russia's most fortified coastal hubs, then Ukraine's capability to reshape the broader Black Sea theater was far greater than previously assumed. The strike also reinforced a long-emerging reality. The age of inexpensive drones and low-cost cruise missiles has rewritten the economics of warfare. A Neptune missile costing under $500,000 destroyed air defense systems worth $300 to $400 million in combined equipment. A drone swarm costing less than a modern armored vehicle forced Russia to halt exports worth tens of millions of dollars per day. Several NATO analysts noted that this cost inversion, small investments causing massive strategic damage, may define conflicts for the next decade. And it is a model that Russia cannot afford to ignore. But the reverberations stretched even farther. In Washington, where Donald Trump returned to the presidency in January 2025, briefings focused on two core questions. First, could Ukraine replicate this strike? And second, what would Russia do in response? Senior officials debated whether increased Ukrainian range through domestic missiles or possible US systems might stabilize the war or push it toward a wider confrontation. Some lawmakers argued that stronger deterrence prevents escalation, pointing to the fact that Ukraine struck infrastructure, not civilians. Others worried that Russia, facing economic strain, could broaden its attacks across the region. Meanwhile, Europe watched with a mixture of alarm and relief. Countries dependent on steady energy markets feared volatility, but defense planners in Eastern Europe saw new possibilities. If Novorossiysk is vulnerable, then the Black Sea itself is entering a new phase. The destruction of multiple air defense systems in a single night showed that Russian military superiority in the region is neither stable nor guaranteed. For nations such as Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, the implications are profound. Shipping corridors may shift, naval strategies may change, and their own coastlines become part of a rapidly evolving strategic map. China also entered the conversation. Though Beijing avoids public criticism of Moscow, Chinese economic planners rely heavily on predictable energy flows and stable maritime routes. Disruptions at Novorossiysk raised concerns about the security of oil shipments that feed China's industrial centers. Analysts noted that Chinese observers were closely studying Ukraine's drone and missile tactics, recognizing that similar vulnerabilities exist across Asia. A large, centralized state with heavy dependence on coastal energy hubs cannot ignore what happened at Novorossiysk. Then came the Middle East dimension. Several energy analysts pointed out that Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, were watching the Black Sea disruptions carefully. For them, reduced Russian export volumes could mean increased leverage in global energy pricing. A prolonged interruption at Novorossiysk might shift market power toward OPEC Plus members, altering their bargaining positions for months. At the same time, they are wary of anything that destabilizes global oil flows. Market shocks benefit them only if they remain controlled. Beyond geopolitics, the Novorossiysk strike entered the global conversation about military doctrine. Experts compared Ukraine's tactics to Israel's long-range precision strategies, Iran's drone campaigns, Azerbaijan's digital targeting systems, and even US naval doctrines emphasizing distributed lethality. Across think tanks from Washington to London and Tokyo, analysts highlighted the same takeaway. The war has become a laboratory for future conflict, and Ukraine's low-cost, high-impact strike is likely to be studied for years. Within this global conversation, three medium-term scenarios emerged. Scenario 1. Continued pressure. Ukraine repeats strikes on Russian export hubs, forcing Moscow to divert air defense systems away from the front. Energy markets tighten. Russia's economic growth projections fall. Diplomacy shifts in Kyiv's favor. Scenario 2. Russian retaliation. Facing economic strain, Russia intensifies its attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. This could include larger missile barrages or attempts to strike Ukrainian production facilities. But doing so would further reveal gaps in Russia's own defenses. Scenario 3. Strategic stalemate. Both sides adjust. Ukraine recalibrates strikes to avoid overly disrupting global markets. Russia reinforces its ports with improved defenses and relocates key systems from Crimea or Leningrad Oblast. The war returns to a slower rhythm. Each scenario carries risks and opportunities. But one fact remains constant. Novorossiysk has changed how the world views the war. It proved that a single well-executed strike can carry global consequences. And it showed that Ukraine is not only surviving, but shaping the battlefield with tools and strategies that major powers will now scrutinize carefully. The world is no longer asking whether Ukraine can strike deep into Russian territory. The question now is how often and how far Kyiv is willing to go. The night of November 13th will be remembered as one of the clearest turning points of the war. It began with chaos in Kyiv, sirens, shattered glass, hospital patients evacuated under emergency lights, and families rushing toward basements as explosions rolled through the capital. Russia believed this would be a show of force, a reminder that winter would be a weapon and civilians a target. But before smoke had even settled over Kyiv, Ukraine delivered an answer that echoed far beyond the battlefield. The strike on Novorossiysk was not simply retaliation. It was a message written in fire across the Black Sea. Russia's war can no longer be waged from a distance. Economic engines are now targets. Infrastructure once seen as untouchable can be disabled in a matter of minutes. The Kremlin's belief that its critical export routes were protected by layers of S-300 and S-400 air defenses collapsed overnight. And the images, cranes burning, oil tanks erupting, a mushroom cloud reflecting off the water, served as a stark reminder that the war's front lines are expanding. This moment also forced the world to reconsider the balance of power. Ukraine, using missiles and drones built under wartime pressure, struck deeper and more effectively than many intelligence services predicted. The global reaction was immediate, markets shifted, governments reassessed their positions, and analysts began rethinking the next phase of the war. Even Russia's internal narrative, carefully controlled for years, showed signs of strain as civilians in Krasnodar filmed the sky glowing orange. But amid all this, bigger questions now rise to the surface. Questions that will define not only the next months, but the war's ultimate direction. Will Ukraine continue targeting Russia's economic arteries, pushing the Kremlin closer to a breaking point? Will Russia double down, escalating its attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure in an attempt to force political concessions? And perhaps the most important question for global security, if low-cost missiles and drones can reshape a major power's economy in a single night, what does that mean for future conflicts in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East? The answers are not yet clear, but one thing is certain. The war is entering a new phase. A phase where ports, refineries, and energy corridors become as decisive as artillery duels or frontline advances. A phase where strategy, technology, and economic disruption matter as much as territory. And a phase where every strike carries consequences far beyond its immediate impact. For now, the world watches. Ukraine's next move could tip the balance further. Russia's reaction could reshape the conflict. And the months ahead may reveal whether this strike was a single dramatic moment or the start of a sustained campaign that changes the war entirely. If you want deeper analysis, new updates, and the next chapters of this unfolding story, share your thoughts below. What do you believe comes next? Which strategy will prevail? And how far will Ukraine push this new advantage? Stay tuned, stay sharp, and don't forget to subscribe for more high-level coverage.